Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we continue our exploration of J.R.R. Tolkien's history of Arda and the Elder Days, the Silmarillion, with the Valaquenta. And this is going to be a really interesting and somewhat atypical reading. Atypical for the Silmarillion, certainly. It's going to lead to an atypical episode of Stars and Swords too, I'm afraid to say, because we're going to be doing this week a little bit less of the close reading that is our primary domain, and instead we're going to be looking a little bit at Tolkien's aesthetic choices, because this week he gives us the closest thing that we ever get to a systemic, diagrammatic description of how Middle-earth, how Arda, how all that is, how it all operates. And it's going to be a really fascinating discussion once we get into it. We do have a bit of ground to cover before we get there. We're going to basically outline, as the chapter does, each of the individual Valar, their domains, their powers, their personalities, such as we get, in the brief descriptions of each one of this order of beings within Arda. And then we're going to zoom out and we're going to look at the aesthetic regime that's operating here, how we infer from that aesthetic regime the underlying philosophical principles, and how we see those philosophical principles put into action as politics. It is going to be a really great reading, and I'm very glad that you are here with me this evening. Let's get into it then. I'm wasting no time at all this evening because we do still have, for a very brief chapter, we've got a lot to cover. We're going to begin with what is in effect a recapitulation of the Ainulindalë itself. So let's get into our first slide here with the opening of the Valaquenta, as I can call this up right here. The account of the Valar and the Maiar according to the lore of the Eldar. In the beginning, Eru, the one who in the Elvish tongue is named Ilúvatar, made the Ainur of his thought, and they made a great music before him. In this music the world was begun, for Ilúvatar made visible the song of the Ainur, and they beheld it as a light in the darkness. And many among them became enamored of its beauty, and of its history, which they saw beginning and unfolding as in a vision. Therefore Ilúvatar gave to their vision being, and set it amid the void, and the secret fire was set to burn at the heart of the world, and it was called Ea. Then those of the Ainur who desired it arose and entered into the world at the beginning of time, and it was their task to achieve it, and by their labors to fulfill the vision which they had seen. Long they labored in the regions of Ea, which are vast beyond the thought of elves and men, until in the time appointed was made Arda, the kingdom of earth. Then they put on the raiment of earth, and descended into it, and dwelt therein. So one of the things that we're going to observe this week, that we're going to observe repeatedly as we move through the Silmarillion, but particularly this week, is the way in which each of the discrete parts of the Silmarillion as a bound volume operate with each other and on each other as a series of paratexts, right? The Valaquenta is not a continuation of the Ainulindalë. We can tell that the Valaquenta is not a continuation of the Ainulindalë because here it recapitulates the Ainulindalë, leaving out some really significant portions, right? Where is Melkor in this account? He is nowhere, because this is a very different kind of creation story that has different purposes. It has a different intent. It has a different tone. We're not really getting the same high rhetorical level that we were getting back in the Ainulindalë in last week's reading. This is a little more settled, and it's a little more, what is the word? Well, I want to use the word modern, which of course is an extremely loaded word, particularly when we're talking about Tolkien, but it does feel less biblical, lowercase b biblical, right? It feels of a perspective that is closer to the ground, that is closer to the elves, that is closer even perhaps to man than the Ainulindalë was. Which is not to say that we're not still dealing in some of that high rhetorical order, that we're not still dealing with a lot of metaphor, that we're not still dealing with a lot of inference, that we're not still dealing with, a lot of capital letter proper nouns, excuse me. Instead, we're positioning those things as a part of the world rather than existing apart from the world. I could probably have found a less confusing way to say that, but here we are. So what do we make of the change in emphasis here, right? In the beginning, Eru, the one who in the Elvish tongue is named Ilúvatar, made of the Ainur his thought. Yep, okay, that clarifies perhaps some questions that we had from the Ainulindalë. They made a great music before him. In this music, the world was begun, for Ilúvatar makes visible the song of the Ainur. Again, clarifying the sequence of cause and effect that we saw back in the Ainulindalë, where some of it is shrouded, right, by the high rhetorical order, by the form of language that we're dealing with back in the Ainulindalë. Some of that progression isn't entirely clear, particularly your first or second or third time through the Silmarillion, but here it's laid out pretty starkly, right? First there is Ilúvatar, then there are the Ainur. They make the music, Iluvatar illuminates that music, right? He shows them that they beheld it as a light in the darkness. They become enamored of its beauty and of the history that is unfolding. So Iluvatar gives it being, right? With Ea. He sets it forth amidst the void, and the secret fire was set to burn at the heart of the world. And then many of the Ainur come down into it, and that sets the stage for what we are about to discuss, right? Account of the Valar and the Maiar according to the lore of the Eldar. That is the purpose of the Valaquenta. The Valaquenta literally translating in the Quenya as the story of, or the account of, the Valar. This is our purpose being laid out here right in front of us. We should probably take this opportunity to outline, I guess, a proper interpretive schematic for the Valar, right? We're going to get this distinction between the Valar and the Maiar. It is oftentimes, I think, misunderstood that these are different orders of beings. That is, that there is something taxonomically different between the Valar and the Maiar, and there isn't. They are all the same beings. They are all of the Ainur, right? Every single one of them is an Ainur. The Ainur are the only things that Iluvatar directly creates in that first moment of creation. All of those beings are of the same category. They belong to the same order of being, even though they have very different scales, right? They differ in greatness, but they do not differ in quality. It is when they come into Arda that they are separated into the Valar and the Maiar, the difference being that the Valar are only the most powerful. That's it. It's the... I don't remember if I pulled this quote here. I didn't. I pulled it later in tonight's reading, but we will get to it when we get to it. So, important to understand, no formal difference between the two, no formal hierarchy, really, besides Manwë himself, who we will discuss as we go forward. So, let's take a look then at the Valar. Yeah, we're getting some comments here in the chat that, as Elizabeth says, Tolkien's Catholic is showing. Yeah, I mean, it is a deliberate attempt to reconcile these two impulses, right? To reconcile, well, two impulses, to reconcile multiple impulses, including a thoughtful, considered kind of Catholicism, right? I think that there are oftentimes implications in criticisms of Tolkien's work and his theological schematic of the universe, right? There are oftentimes implied criticisms, veiled criticisms, that it is simply Catholic doctrine, and that Catholic doctrine is somehow lacking in complexity, that is a kind of big theological band-aid that is put over, you know, our relationship with matters religious. And I think that is unfair in every sense, but particularly unfair, of course, when we're talking about Tolkien, who was a very considered theist. He was a very considered Catholic. So, yeah, but he's trying to reconcile that with all of these other influences, and in so doing, seeking to lose none of them. And also, as we'll see in this week's reading, seeking to expand our understanding and the simple limits. To suggest limits is to suggest that there are certain things being prescribed, I suppose. To focus on areas of Catholic doctrine and Catholic belief which are perhaps underdeveloped in that tradition, in that specific religious tradition. We'll get to some of that as we move forward. So here we have the account of the Valar themselves. The great among these spirits, the elves name the Valar, the Powers of Arda, and men have often called them gods. The lords of the Valar are 7, and the Valir, the queens of the Valar, are 7 also. These were their names in the Elvish tongue as it was spoken in Valinor, though they have other names in the speech of the elves in Middle-earth, and their names among men are manifold. The names of the lords in due order are Manwë, Ulmo, Aule, Orome, Mandos, Lorien, and Tulkas. And the names of the queens are Varda, Yavanna, Nienna, Este, Vere, Vana, and Nessa. Melkor is counted no longer among the Valar, and his name is not spoken upon earth. So, a quick note here. This is the chapter that causes people to fall out of the Silmarillion. This is the first chapter that causes people to fall out of the Silmarillion because, as I say, more so than any other part of this book, at least until we get to the geography of Beleriand, which is, I'll admit, the part of the book that I have the most trouble with, this is the part of the book that is most focused on simply relaying factual information. Here are the names of these powers, these things that men call gods in Middle-earth, right? These are their names, these are their other names, these are their other names, these are their relationships, these are their qualities, these are their domains and dominions, and it's just a catalog. It is a fully developed schematic of this pantheistic approach to creation and to governance, right? The two kind of aspects of the benevolent and present God figure in any kind of religious tradition. So we're going to move through all of these names, and we're going to move through them fairly quickly, because at this point, it is not important that you remember every name attached to every single one of the Valar. There is an approach oftentimes recommended that you only pay attention to the necessary ones, that you only really pay attention to maybe 6, because really only 6 of the Valar are going to be super important as we move through the rest of the Silmarillion. And you can maybe even distill that down a little bit too, honestly. I'm going to recommend that you not do that. I'm going to recommend that, as we will after we've moved through the accounts of each of the Valar in turn, I am going to try to present to you the schematic as a whole. I'm going to try to present to you the pantheon as it exists in its full complexity, because I think that it is easier to understand each of these characters and to appreciate each of these characters, each of these powers, these forces, in their proper context, in their proper relationship with the other powers of Arda. So maybe don't worry about getting every single name. Maybe don't worry about keeping track of all of the various aspects of each one of these figures, but do try and encompass the actual magnitude of the Valar themselves, right? We're going to get, obviously, a few Maiar named hereafter, but the Valar are going to be our primary focus for tonight's reading, and just kind of get the sense of them more so than the specifics, and then we're going to put those senses together and try and form a cohesive and coherent landscape of power here in Arda. Let's, the begats, as Elizabeth says in the chat here. Exactly, right? It is a lot of begatting. And as I say, when we get to the geography of Beleriand, it's going to feel even more arduous as we move forward. So these are our titles, right? And here we're repositioning repositioning the position of the text as well. We are illuminating the position of the text, right? As a paratext with the Ainulindalë. Where does the Valaquenta sit? Well, we're clearly not in that same tradition of the oldest days, right? We're not drawing this directly from the Valar and representing it as a factual account with the elves, kneeling at the feet of the Valar in the earliest days of Valinor, kind of hearing the stories of the time before creation. And we know that for sure because we can already see new elements coming into the story, which, if we are looking at this as an historical document, have not yet been presented to us, right? Middle-earth is being presented to us here. We're getting the idea that the Valar are known to the men as well. We're looking back retroactively at that. Their names among men are manifold. We get the development of the Elvish tongues themselves, the 2 chief Elvish languages, which we'll talk about a little more as we move through the rest of the book. So the names of the lords in due order, right? The 7 male-appearing figures of the Valar: Manwe, Ulmo, Aule, Orome, Mandos, Lorien, and Tokus. And the names of the queens: Varda, Yavanna, Nienna, Este, Vere, Vana, and Nessa. Melkor, of course, very, very intentionally here set apart. Melkor is counted no longer among the Valar, and his name is not spoken upon the earth. So let's get into then our discussion of Manwe, the first and greatest. I mentioned earlier, right, that we have no hierarchical distinction among the Ainur, that we have no formal hierarchical distinction, right? Some are greater, some are lesser, absolutely. But really within the Valar, and the Valar are set apart from the Maiar because they are the greatest, but within the Valar there's no set hierarchy, though there is, because Manwe is the boss. Manwe is like the king. This is his purpose. This is the quote that we get. Manwe and Melkor were brethren in the thought of Iluvatar. The mightiest of those Ainur who came into the world was in his beginning Melkor, but Manwe is dearest to Iluvatar and understands most clearly his purposes. He was appointed to be in the fullness of time the first of all kings, lord of the realm of Arda and ruler of all that dwelt therein. In Arda his delight is in the winds and the clouds, and in all the regions of the air, from the heights to the depths, from the utmost borders of the vale of Arda to the breezes that blow in the grass. Sulimo he is surnamed, lord of the breath of Arda. All swift birds, strong of wing, he loves, and they come and go at his bidding. So, this is where we start getting the parade of names, right? Manwe, translated from the Quenya, is simply Blessed One, right? It's setting him apart in much the same way as we set apart Eru Iluvatar, right? Eru means the one or the only one. Here, Manwe is kind of getting that same treatment in the Quenya. Blessed One. Sulimo, which we get here, literally translates as, it's presented as Lord of the Breath of Arda, but it actually literally just translates as the breather. He is also known as Aran Ainur, Ainior, I guess it is, which in Sindarin is the Elder King, right? So we're really elevating him here, but crucially, he was not the guy. He was not always intended, well, Or was he always intended to be the guy, right? Because there's some ambiguity here. The mightiest of those Ainur who came into the world was, in his beginning, Melkor. Melkor was the mightiest, but Manwë is dearest to Ilúvatar and understands most clearly his purposes. He was appointed to be in the fullness of time the first of all kings. Well, okay, we're getting a sequence of events there, but the positioning of that latter thought with regard to the earlier thoughts is important. Was Melkor intended to be in the fullness of time, the first of all kings, or was Manwë always intended to be, because throughout he is dearest to Ilúvatar and understands most clearly his purposes? We can only speculate on that. But his domain, as it's presented to us, right? Although, yeah, okay, let me pause here just to note. In this way, Manwë is distinct because he has two sets of responsibilities, in effect, right? He has the responsibility of all the Valar. He is the king of the Valar, right? But he is also what we might think of as the Lord of Air, right? In Arda, his delight is in the wind and in the clouds and in all the regions of the air, from the heights to the depths, from the utmost borders of the Vale of Arda. The Vale of Arda is the atmosphere of the planet, right? So from the very fringes of the atmosphere, there on the threshold of space itself, and the breezes that blow in the grass, right? Everything between is his domain. But he has this dual role, and we might want to speculate a little whether or not Melkor was originally intended, whether, you know, that authority that Melkor seeks to wield in the creative act is actually a reflection of his original purpose, which was to be the leader of the Valar. Again, we can speculate. I have some more thoughts on that. I got a really interesting email from James, I think, which we'll address a little later in tonight's reading. So, Manwë, and we're going to resist the urge throughout tonight's reading, throughout our entire discussion of the Silmarillion. We're going to resist the urge to directly map any of the Valar to any pre-existing theistic figures, any pre-existing deities in any pantheon from around the world, right? Manwë is not Zeus or is not Jupiter or is not, you know, there's no direct comparison. There are overlaps, obviously, right? There are interpretive moves we can make to kind of associate certain figures with certain pre-existing figures in mythologies, but we're going to try and resist that. We're going to try and read Manwë as we move forward, right? Vincent says here in the chat, it seems to be that it's not strength, but the understanding of Ilúvatar that gives Manwë this place of authority. Yes, exactly, right? He is the closest to Ilúvatar, but what is the power of that comprehension, right? Manwë is dearest to Ilúvatar and understands most clearly his purposes. I keep thinking about the passage back that we discussed last week in the Ainur that upon their creation, each of the Ainur comprehends only their own mind a little, and it's only through the singing that they begin to understand others. And we should remember, too, that that Melkor is the chief architect of the second theme of the music, right? That I think we might... we're definitely going to talk about this a little later, because I think there's a really great interpretive move that we can make vis-a-vis the third theme. But it's possible, I think, to read the three themes in the Ainur as belonging sequentially to Melkor, to Manwë, and then ultimately to Nienna, who we'll talk about in just a little while. Let's keep going here, because we're only one into the whole of the Valar. So let's move on to talk instead about... one more thing to pull out very quickly here. We are going to circle back to this when we have the full schematic later in tonight's session. Manwë and Melkor were brethren in the thought of Ilúvatar. I don't know what that means. We're going to talk about it in just a little while. Let's move on to Varda. With Manwë dwells Varda, Lady of the Stars, who knows all the regions of Ea. Too great is her beauty to be declared in the words of men or of elves, for the light of Ilúvatar lives still in her face. In light is her power and her joy. Out of the depths of Ea, she comes to the aid of Manwë. For Melkor she knew from before the making of the music, and rejected him, and he hated her, and feared her more than all others whom Eru made. Manwë and Varda are seldom parted, and they remain in Valinor. Their halls are above the everlasting snow, upon Oilose, the uttermost tower of Taniquetil, tallest of all the mountains upon earth. When Manwë there ascends his throne and looks forth, if Varda is beside him, he sees further than all other eyes, through mist and through darkness and over the leagues of the sea. And if Manwë is with her, Varda hears more clearly than all the other ears the sound of voices that cry from east to west, from the hills and the valleys and from the dark places that Melkor has made upon earth. Of all the great ones who dwell in this world, the elves hold Varda most in reverence and in love. Albereth, they name her, and they call upon her name out of the shadows of Middle-earth and uplift it in song at the rising of the stars. So Varda, queen of the Valar. Varda, interestingly, in the Quenya, directly translates as the sublime, which is extremely powerful. She's also subtitled Elentari, which is Queen of the Stars, and also literally in the Sindarin, Elbereth also means Queen of the Stars. And of course, also in the Sindarin, Gilthoniel, Kindler of the Stars. And if you've read The Lord of the Rings, if you are coming to the Silmarillion with all of that knowledge rattling around in your head, this is one of the first things that you're really going to recognize, right? That word Elbereth. Elbereth, they name her, and they call upon her name out of the shadows of Middle-earth. They sure do. How often do we see that in The Lord of the Rings? Elbereth, exclamation point. Gilthoniel, exclamation point, right? The elves calling out in song and in worship, those two things not necessarily distinct for the elves of Middle-earth, of course, calling out to her in song, still praising her name, untold tens of thousands of years later, right? The exact chronology of Middle-earth is something we'll get into next week, but it's going to make your head rattle just a little bit. So, there's so much here, right? Varda, the Lady of the Stars, who knows all the regions of Ea. Again, we're going to draw this distinction between Ea, the entire universe, and Arda, usually the planet itself, right? Usually the planet upon which the children of Iluvatar wake. Too great is her beauty to be declared in the words of men or of elves, for the light of Iluvatar still lives still in her face. So she is connected most powerfully with the stars, of course, but also with all light, as we'll see as we move through the actual history of Arda and her great works. Out of the deeps of Ea she came to the aid of Manwë, for Melkor she knew from before the making of the music, and rejected him, and he hated her and feared her more than all others whom Eru made. We were talking a little last week about Melkor's position and about Tolkien's clarity of understanding, right? That Melkor is just this toxic dude in many ways, and this, of course, is a perfect representation of that. Melkor she knew from before the making of the music and rejected him, and he, of course, hated her. This is how creatures like Melkor turn into creatures like Melkor, for sure. They live together, the uttermost tower of Taniquetil, and you'll notice again here, right, we're getting locations. We're getting places that have not yet been named to us. We're getting detail about those places. So there is the earth, the tallest of all the mountains is Taniquetil. Upon that, right, the halls above the everlasting snow, upon... I always struggle with this. I always want to hesitate before I say Oiolose. Oiolose is how we pronounce this, I guess. The tallest peak of the mountain Taniquetil, though later, I think, even in the Silmarillion, there's going to be some confusion over Oiolose and Taniquetil, and a certain kind of coexistence of those terms, and a certain confusion over clarity. But my understanding is that Oiolose, oh my goodness me, Oiolose is the central peak of Taniquetil itself. It means everlasting whiteness. Taniquetil simply means high snow peak. So we've got our powers, right? And we see a certain measure of connection between the two, that they're, even here in the realm of Arda, they are expanded by their proximity to one another. We don't actually get this laid out here for us very precisely, except that I guess they dwell together, right? And we're going to be a little socially conservative about this, but they are married, whatever that means, right? They are in a spousal relationship, Manwë and Varda, and we see how that interaction fuels their abilities, right? And we mustn't think of this as fueling their abilities as though they have, fourth level powers when they're apart, but fifth level powers when they're together. It's more that they are enriched the one by the other, right? And we can link all of this back to the Ainulindalë and the creation together in this mutual space of new and wonderful things, right? We are all enriched by connection and harmony with others. We see that practiced right here. When Manwë there ascends his throne and looks forth, if Varda is beside him, he sees further than all other eyes, through mist, through darkness, and over the leagues of the sea. If Manwë is with her, Varda hears more clearly than all other ears the sound of voices that cry from east to west, from the hills and the valleys and from the dark places that Melkor has made upon earth, right? They are empowered by each other. They are more fully connected to Arda in their love for each other as they are in their love for Arda itself. Yes, to address the comment here in the chat from Vinton, don't worry, it's all going to be okay. There is a diagram coming, which I hope will help, but hey, we'll find out. Let's move on then to Ulmo. Ulmo is the Lord of Waters. He is alone. He dwells nowhere long, but moves as he will in all the deep waters about the earth or under the earth. He is next in might to Manwë, and before Valinor was made, he was closest to him in friendship. But thereafter he went seldom to the councils of the Valar, unless great matters were in debate. For he kept all Arda in thought, and he has no need of any resting place. Moreover, he does not love to walk upon land, and will seldom clothe himself in a body after the manner of his peers. If the children of Eru beheld him, they were filled with great dread. For in the arising of the king of the sea was terrible, as a mountain wave that strides to the land, with dark helm foam-crested and raiment of mail shimmering from silver down to the shadows of green. The trumpets of Manwë are loud, but Ulmo's voice is deep as the deeps of the ocean which only he has seen. Nonetheless, Ulmo loves both elves and men, and never abandoned them, not even when they lay under the wrath of the Valar. At times he will come unseen to the shores of Middle-earth, or pass far inland up firths of the sea, and there make music upon his great horns, the Ulumuri, that are wrought of white shell, and those to whom the music comes hear it ever after in their hearts, and longing for the sea never leaves them again. But mostly Ulmo speaks to those who dwell in Middle-earth, with voices that are heard only as the music of water. For all seas, lakes, rivers, fountains, and springs are in his government, so that the elves say that the spirit of Ulmo runs in all the veins of the world. Thus news comes to Ulmo, even in the deeps of all the needs and griefs of Arda, which otherwise would be hidden from Manwë. This is one of my favorite passages. I absolutely love this description of Ulmo. Vincent saying here in the chat, don't think of Poseidon, don't think of Poseidon. I mean, there are overlaps, obviously, but there are other elements too, right? We saw at the very end of the Ainulindalë how working together with Manwë to increase the beauty of Arda, Ulmo really expresses this love, this fondness. And that is a peculiar thing because he is, as we note, alone, right? He dwells nowhere long, but moves as he will in all the deep waters about the earth or under the earth, right? He's extremely powerful, but he's also solitary. Does that remind us of anyone? But the difference between Ulmo and Melkor is that Melkor goes off into the void and thinks thoughts that he ought not to think, whereas Ulmo always holds in his mind Arda, for he kept all Arda in thought. He has no need of any resting place, right? He's still a part of the world. He is connected to it. I love the description, too, here, of the mail shimmering from silver down to the shadows of green. The trumpets of Manwë are loud, but Ulmo's voice is deep as the deeps of the ocean, which only he has seen. So he has a domain that is more distinct, I would say, from the other Valar than any of the others, right? There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of consonance and harmony between them, but Ulmo is even conceptually kind of distinct. And of course, again, we're tying back to the events of the Lord of the Rings, right? He's awakening the sea longing within people, right? He can make the music upon his great horns, the Ulumuri that are wrought of white shell, and those to whom the music comes hear it ever after in their hearts, and longing for the sea never leaves them again. This feels very poetic and familiar to those of us coming to the Silmarillion from the Lord of the Rings. And if we're coming to the Silmarillion from the Lord of the Rings too, we might at this point be raising some questions, such as, what was the wrath of the Valar? At what point in history does this happen? This is another move by Tolkien to reposition this text that we are reading in a different temporal sphere than the Ainulindalë, right? The Ainulindalë seems to be recorded pretty soon after the elves meet the Valar for the first time, right? Where they kind of go straight to them and ask them the questions of creation. This is created much later. Ulmo loves elves and men and never abandoned them, not even when they lay under the wrath of the Valar. We're going to find out about the wrath of the Valar in chapter 9 of the Quenta Silmarillion. We're going to find out about it in about, what is that, 5 weeks from now, I guess? But this is further evidence that this is a much later text than the Ainulindalë, and we can lean into some of the interpretive moves that are being presented to us. Let's move on here to, I said last week, my favorite, and God, he is my favorite of the Valar, but not perhaps the most interesting. Of all of the figures in this particular pantheon, he is the one that maps maybe closest to some well, maybe not closest, but maps very closely to some pre-existing gods of like the classical pantheon, right? He's kind of giving Hephaestus, he's kind of giving Vulcan too. Let's read about Aule. Aule has might little less than Ulmo. His lordship is over all the substances of which Arda is made. In the beginning he wrought much in fellowship with Manwë and Ulmo, and the fashioning of all lands was his labour. He is a smith and a master of all crafts, and he delights in works of skill, however small, as much as in the mighty building of old. His are the gems that lie deep in the earth, and the gold that is fair in his hand, no less than the walls of the mountains and the basins of the sea. The Noldor learned most of him, and he was ever their friend. Melkor was jealous of him, for Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers. and there was long strife between them, in which Melkor either marred or undid the works of Aule, and Aule grew weary in repairing the tumults and disorders of Melkor. Both also desired to make things of their own that should be new and unthought of by others, and delighted in the praise of their skill, but Aule remained faithful to Eru, and submitted all he did to his will, and he did not envy the works of others, but sought and gave counsel. Whereas Melkor spent his spirit in envy and in hate, until at last he could make nothing save in mockery of the thought of others, and all their works he destroyed if he could. So again, another recapitulation here, right, from the Ainulindalë. We've already kind of had this discussion. What is it that separates Aule and Melkor? Well, it's that Aule loves the craft itself and not the consequence of his craft. He doesn't seek to hoard treasures and riches. He doesn't seek to exercise dominance, enduring dominance over the things that he creates. He just loves to make things. And you'll note here, he does love praise for his skill, right? This is a way in which they are similar. He likes to be recognized for his skill, but that's it. It's the praise due an artist, not the praise due the wealthy, not the praise due the lord and dominator of others. Melkor was jealous of him, for Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers, which is a really interesting point of clarification that is adjacent to some understandings that we had reading the Ainulindalë, but of course we've just been told that Manwë and Melkor were like brothers in the mind of Ilúvatar. And yet, Melkor is definitively closest to Aule in terms of his skill set, his preoccupations, right? He could have been more readily Aule than any other figure in the Valar. Vinton's calling out, okay, we're going to take this opportunity then to jump ahead to the email that I got from James, because I think that this is so interesting. Yes, absolutely. Manwë is wind, Aule is earth, Ulmo is water. Does that make Melkor fire? I want to find the email that I had from James. Yes, that simply says this, that is it possible to infer that Melkor's position should have been some kind of Lord of Fire? That this, in fact... I need to find my notes. This is terrible. I'm sorry. Yes, here we go. That he should be the Valar associated with the fire. That's why his manifest influence over the creation of Arda is the raging fire and the bitter, cold, immoderate. A great opportunity to use that phrase again, James. And furthermore, that his presence as the Valar of fire would balance this classical elementalism that we might expect. Water and Ulmo, air and Manwë, earth and Aule, fire and Melkor. I think that this is a really interesting thought. I think it is a compelling thought. I think it is a strong argument given the text in front of us, for sure. And I don't even think that it precludes or is incompatible with my reading last week that Melkor is also part of Ilúvatar's own creative impulse, right? Because the functional mechanism of that creativity is the flame imperishable. It is the sacred fire. We are associating creation and fire from the jump, not even within the domain of Melkor, but within the domain of Ilúvatar. And I find that pretty compelling, honestly, right? It is going to be a consistent feature of Melkor and of those who fall under Melkor's influence, that they will be connected with the fire, that they will be connected with the destructive fire, particularly. And I like that very much as a reading. I find it compatible, both with the text that we have and with our expanded understanding of the pantheon as a whole, and certainly Melkor's role as we move forward. So, good read, Vinton, good read, James. I'm into it. Okay, let's pick up the pace here, because we're already 35 minutes in, and I'm telling you, we've still got a long way to go. Let me clarify here quickly. Aule, the Quenya for the word invention, which is pretty great. Also known as Oli, O-L-I, which is the Sindarin of dream, which I find very interesting too. He will later be known as Mahal in the Khuzdur, in the Dwarvish language. He will be known as Mahal, which simply means maker. Spoilers, we're going to get a chance to talk about Aule and his creative impulses next week in our reading of chapters 1 and 2 of the Quenta Silmarillion. Let's move on, though, to the spouse of Aule. The spouse of Aule is Yavanna, the giver of fruits. She is the lover of all things that grow in the earth, and all their countless forms she holds in her mind, from the trees like towers in forests long ago to the moss upon stones, or the small and secret things in the mold. In reverence, Yavanna is next to Varda among the queens of the Valar. In the form of a woman, she is tall and robed in green, but at times she takes other shapes. Some there are who have seen her standing like a tree under heaven, crowned with the sun, and from all its branches there spilled a golden dew upon the barren earth, and it grew green with corn. But the roots of the tree were in the waters of Ulmo, and the winds of Manwë spoke in its leaves. Kementari, queen of the earth, she is surnamed in the Eldarin tongue. So, a lot here in terms of the positioning of each of the Valar alongside one another, right? Alongside Aule of the earth, the maker, the craftsman of the Valar, we have Yavanna, the giver of fruits. Closest in like traditional pantheon to a kind of like a kind of harvest goddess, I suppose, like a goddess of fertility and growth, though again we don't want to necessarily just distill her down to the closest approximation that we can make from an existing book of mythology. She is a lover of all things that grow in the earth. She holds all of their forms in her mind. She is next to Varda in reverence, tall and robed in green when she takes the form of a woman, but she doesn't need to take the form of a woman, of course. She can set that aside and become other shapes. Some there are who have seen her standing like a tree under heaven, crowned with the sun, and from all its branches there spilled a golden dew upon the barren earth, and it grew green with corn. And I'm interested here in the use of corn. I need to go and like study my history and my real world, history of agriculture to find out why Tolkien here is using the word corn, a word that I would associate with the New World, in a schematic where he generally avoids doing so. I'll need to go and dig into that. I meant to before tonight's session and then lost track of it because there is simply so much. Yavanna, quite literally, right? The giver of fruits. Kementari here, queen of the earth. That's the exact translation that's presented to us in the Eldarin. She is also known as Yvonne, I-V-O-N, in the Sindarin, which also just means giver of fruits. And you'll notice here as we move through that we're getting fewer names and the names are less ornamental as we descend the power hierarchy of the Valar here. No strict power hierarchy, of course, but as we descend to the more specific and more interesting of the Valar. Speaking of which, let's get to Námo and Irmo. What's that? You don't know Námo and Irmo? Oh, perhaps you're thinking of Mandos and Lórien. The Feanturi, masters of spirits, are brethren, and they are called most often Mandos and Lórien. Yet these are rightly the names of the places of their dwelling, and their true names are Námo and Irmo. Námo the Elder dwells in Mandos, which is westward in Valinor. He is the keeper of the houses of the dead and the summoner of the spirits of the slain. He forgets nothing, and he knows all things that shall be, save only those that lie still in the freedom of Ilúvatar. He is the doomsman of the Valar, but he pronounces his dooms and his judgments only at the bidding of Manwë. Vere, the weaver, is his spouse, who weaves all things that have ever been in time into her storied webs, and the halls of Mandos that ever widen as the ages pass are clothed with them. Irmo the Younger is the master of visions and dreams. In Lórien are his gardens in the land of the Valar, and they are the fairest of all places in the world, filled with many spirits. Este the Gentle, healer of hurts and of weariness, is his spouse. Grey is her raiment, and rest is her gift. She walks not by day, but sleeps upon an island in the tree-shadowed lake of Lorelin. From the fountains of Irmo and Este, all those who dwell in Valinor draw refreshment, and often the Valar come themselves to Lórien and find their repose and easing of the burden of Arda. So, 4 here in the space of a single slide. Let's talk a little first about Námo, I guess, about Mandos, right? Mandos and Lórien, the Feanturi literally translates as masters of spirits. Fea, meaning spirit. We're going to talk a lot about that as we move through the rest of the book. So these two combined, and their sister, who we'll talk about in just a moment, I find this part of the schematic really interesting, right? Because we've done the basics. We've got, as we've pointed out, right? We've got air and earth and water and life and growing things, right? This is the first time where we start to deviate from that and we begin to see, through Tolkien's application of his aesthetic, a sense of where the underlying philosophy lies. And we can think of these two as being opposed. Obviously, they are balanced, right? They are siblings. They are brethren, right? Námo and Irmo, Mandos and Lórien. They are both most commonly known by the places that they live, because the places that they live have a kind of counterpoint, but it's not a simple counterpoint. It's not an easy opposition. It's not a trite juxtaposition. There's something more developed happening here. So Namor, Mandos, right? The halls of Mandos are the houses of the dead. They are the places that the dead go when they are awaiting whatever happens to them in the end. And that judgment is wielded by Mandos because he never forgets anything and he knows everything that is not the sole reserve of Ilúvatar, right? The freedom of Ilúvatar. Ilúvatar can still intercede and change things, but everything that is fixed, everything that was in the song, is known to Mandos. He is the doomsman of the Valar, and doom, right, not being used here in its modern sense of something terrible happening, but in its traditional medieval sense of like a judgment. We will all remember, of course, Elrond sitting at the Council of Elrond in The Lord of the Rings with the immortal line, "That is the doom that we must deem," right? That's the sense of doom here, judgment. That is the name of Mandos here, right? He is the doomsman of the Valar. He is the judge of the Valar. He is the Valar who is the judge, I guess, is probably the better way of saying that. He does not judge the Valar. He judges all the children of Ilúvatar that pass into the halls of Mandos. And Veri the Weaver is, of course, this preserver of history, an archivist of history. Everything that happens gets woven into her tapestries, which then adorn the walls of this purgatorial house of the dead, right? The idea of the halls of Mandos being shrouded in the living history of Middle-earth, so that those souls, in part, who are sent to the halls of Mandos early, and I don't want to talk too freely or too early about what death looks like in Middle-earth, because we're going to get our opportunities to do that firsthand, in effect. But those who are sent to the halls of Mandos get to witness the unfolding of the history of Middle-earth through the tapestries of Veri, who is married, wed to Námo, better known as Mandos. And then we have this counterpoint to the pair of them, right? As they are documenting history as it unfolds with this stern doomsman judgment, right? With this perfect clarity of knowledge, we contrast that with visions and dreams. We contrast that with things that are themselves unfixed and imprecise and mutable and open to alteration, and also open to a kind of ambiguity, a kind of metaphor enfolded within them, right? What separates the vision from the reality? I mean, unless we're looking back at the Ainulindalë, in which case it is separated by, Ea and the being of the thing. But what separates reality and visions and dreams in like a more familiar sense to us is that notion of ambiguity and metaphor, that these things are representational rather than being specific and fixed. So in Lorien, the Gardens of Lorien, from which he takes his own name too, this is the fairest of all places in the world, filled with many spirits. Esti the Gentle, healer of hurts and of weariness, is his spouse, right? So rather than documenting the unfolding history in art, as Vedi does, Esti is there to recover, right? To restore. She walks not by day, but sleeps upon an island in the tree-shadowed lake of Lorelin. From the fountains of Irmo and Esti, all those who dwell in Valinor draw refreshment. And often the Valar come themselves to Lorien, and there find repose and easing of the burden of Arda. Lorien here, literally in the Quenya, dreamland, right? And of course, this is familiar to us as well from Lothlorien, the bloom, the flower of the dreamland, in effect, but built in a sense, in replication of this original Lorien. It's a really beautiful balancing of two things that I think in most traditional mythologies would not be balanced, right? The idea of purgatory and the garden being kind of set in opposition to one another. I really love the development of it. Again, we'll talk a little more about that when we get to the schematic fully as we move forward. But let's talk about the most interesting member of the Valar. Let's talk about Nienna, sister to Mandos and to Lorien. Mightier than Esta is Nienna, sister of the Feanturi. She dwells alone. She is acquainted with grief and mourns for every wound that Arda has suffered in the marring of Melkor. So great was her sorrow as the music unfolded that her song turned to lamentation long before its end, and the sound of mourning was woven into the themes of the world before it began. But she does not weep for herself, and those who hearken to her learn pity and endurance and hope. Her halls are west of west upon the borders of the world, and she comes seldom to the city of Valamar, where all is glad. She goes rather to the halls of Mandos, which are near to her own, and all those who wait in Mandos cry to her, for she brings strength to the spirit and turns sorrow to wisdom. The windows of her house look outward from the walls of the world. And that's the good stuff, right? We'll get some more explication about the halls of Nienna as we move through. But I mentioned Nienna, of course, earlier, kind of jumping my interpretive maneuver, I suppose, preempting my interpretive maneuver, that if Melkor is the chief architect of the first theme, as he may be, that's ambiguous, but it's a possible reading for sure. And if Manwë is the chief architect of the second theme of Ilúvatar, which we know for sure because we're told so in the Ainulindalë, then Nienna is the chief architect, or may well be the chief architect of the third theme. You'll remember the quote, "The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow from which its beauty chiefly came." In earlier versions of the story, which I'm not presenting to kind of give us any additional insight, but to show rather where Tolkien was in terms of his aesthetic appreciation of this expanded pantheon. In earlier versions of the story, Nienna was not the sister of Mandos and Lorien. Nienna was the sister of Melkor and Manwë. She was a heavy hitter in the Valar, right? And the Valar are so few in number that, in a sense, they're all heavy hitters. Of course, they are, in fact, distinguished by being the heaviest of all the hitters upon Arda. But positioning her there, even temporarily, really gives us a sense of how important Nienna is to Tolkien's understanding of the function of the world, of how the world moves and operates. This idea that being familiar... Once again, every time I want to start a thought, I realize, no, I want to start that thought 3 steps earlier, right? Observe simply the language here. She is acquainted with grief. We've had dominion and we've had mastery, right? To Manwë, he loves the air and is the lord of it, right? Ulmo loves the depths of the ocean and is the lord of them. But here, there's no sense that Nienna dominates grief or sadness or sorrow. She just knows them. She is acquainted with grief and mourns for every wound that Arda has suffered in the marring of Melkor. Not specifically the marring of Melkor, right? There's nothing specific about what Melkor has done to Arda, except in the sense that every imperfection in Arda is the marring of Melkor, right? All evil is the marring of Melkor, right? The notion of Arda marred is the notion of the imperfect world. And it is imperfect because of Melkor, and it is imperfect because it contains this destructive, malign, evil, selfish force. This underlying malevolence. So great was her sorrow as the music unfolded that her song turned to lamentation. So we get the idea, right? That she is, in much the same way as Veri is recording history in her tapestries in the halls of Mandos, so perhaps we could interpret Nienna as simply being mindful of the marring, that she weeps for this broken world, and that the grief is enough in itself. But that's not what she does. That's not the font of her power at all, as much as power is the right word. That is not the consequence of Nienna's grief. The consequence of Nienna's grief is much more important. She doesn't weep for herself, but those who hearken to her learn pity and endurance in hope. Specifically, who are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the souls stranded in the halls of Mandos, right? They cry to her, and she brings strength to the spirit, and turns sorrow to wisdom. This is what the power of grief is in Tolkien's understanding. Not that sorrow ought to be avoided, perhaps, but that sorrow, through pity and empathy, can be transformed into wisdom. That Nienna doesn't cry for herself, she cries for everyone else, and in so doing, gives them strength. This is, as far as I'm aware, completely unique. This is, for all of the many reference points that we find in the Valar and throughout the Silmarillion to these classical mythologies, these primarily Roman, Greek, but also, yes, Norse, Finnish mythologies that Tolkien is echoing and also tying his own subcreative act to. In all of that, I think that Nienna is wholly original and absolutely magnificent, because, of course, Nienna, in that recognition of grief, in the recognition that through the marring of Arda, through the calamity, greater beauty and wisdom and strength can come, right? You'll remember from the song, it's not that the song is slow and deep and sad and beautiful. It's that the song is slow and deep and beautiful because it is sad, right? The sadness from which its beauty, I'm saying sadness and it's throwing me off, the sorrow from which its beauty chiefly came, right? It is beautiful because it is sorrowful. It is beautiful because of Nienna. That is eucatastrophe. That is the fundamental principle that Tolkien takes as the foundation of his world, that there's a crack that lets the light in, to echo Cohen, of course. So, Nienna, right? A sister of the Fanturi, notably not one of the Fanturi herself. And we'll circle back around to the Fanturi, right? The masters of the spirits belonging to Mandos and to Lorien, right? We can see, I think, the way in which the Doomsman of the Valar is kind of a master of spirit, but in what way is Lorien a master of spirit, except through recovery, right? Except through the consolation and restoration. These, of course, are the principles that Tolkien explicitly enumerates in his excellent essay on fairy stories. This is the principle of fantasy fiction. These are some of the things that fantasy fiction can do here. Okay, let's get into here. I'm completely lost the chat. I'm so sorry. There's so much material to cover. I will go back and read everything. And if you guys have like specific questions that you'd like to call out, by all means get in touch. It is seeming increasingly likely that I'm going to have to host additional Q&A sessions as we move through the Silmarillion, just to address some of these excellent pieces of correspondence that I'm receiving, because it feels a little, I don't know, a little thin, honestly, to receive some of this fantastic email and then just reply via email, because I think that some of those messages, some of those thoughts, some of those insights deserve a larger audience, you know. So maybe we'll just do a bit of a Q&A session and wrap some of that stuff up. So, yeah, no, exactly. Vinton's calling out here. She kind of represents the long defeat of Lord of the Rings being a all things work together, good in the end through Iluvatar's song. Yeah, that principle that even in the marring, a greater good comes, right? As Iluvatar says to Melkor back in the Ainulindalë, there's nothing you can do. Son, there's nothing you can do that's going to wreck this, because everything that you try is only going to lead to all the more fully to my intention. But that doesn't mean within the realm of Arda that there isn't consequence. It doesn't mean that there isn't pain. It doesn't mean that there isn't sorrow. It doesn't mean that there isn't injustice. We're going to move through all of those things. But in exactly the same way as Melkor's rebellion is turned to Iluvatar's purpose, ultimately, all of this sorrow is going to be turned to more beauty, to more greatness than if it had never been realized in the first place. It's a pretty good, solid, foundational underpinning of any piece of theology, I think, personally. Let's move through. Let's get going into really kind of just wrapping up here as we move through the rest of the Valar. We should talk, of course, about Tolkis. Greatest in strength and deeds of prowess is Tolkis, who is surnamed Staldo, the Valiant. He came last to Arda to aid the Valar in the first battles with Melkor. He delights in wrestling and in contests of strength, and he rides no steed, for he can outrun all things that go on feet, and he is tireless. His hair and beard are golden, and his flesh ruddy. His weapons are his hands. He has little heed for either the past or the future, and is of no avail as a counselor, but is a hardy friend. His spouse is Nessa, the sister of Orome, and she also is lithe and fleet-footed. Deer she loves, and they follow her train whenever she goes in the wild, but she can outrun them, swift as an arrow with the wind in her hair. In dancing she delights, and she dances in Valimar on lawns of never-fading green. So a couple of really interesting things here, right? In addition to Tolkis, the champion of the Valar, and Nessa, the dancer, right? One of the things that we should note here is that Tolkis does not enter Arda when all of the other Valar come into Arda. He does not come as a part of this creative force. He is of the order of Ainur that remain with Iluvatar until history has unfolded to the point where we get the first battles with Melkor, which we, of course, haven't seen yet. Then he comes into Arda in order to lend his strength to the forces led by Manwë in opposition to Melkor. We're going to see that happen. It's pretty great. I love here, too. And again, I want to be super careful how we interpret this, because we're getting real himbo vibes here from Tolkis, right? We're getting like a real sense of, yeah, he shows up and he's all, you know, he's ruddy-faced and his hair and his beard are golden and his weapons are his hands. Right? We're getting a kind of, we know this guy. We know this archetype. And it's very easy, I think, to lean into that line. He has little heed for either the past or the future and is of no avail as a counselor, but he is a hardy friend. It's easy to get a certain himbo vibe from Tolkis right there, right? But I don't think that we're supposed to interpret this as meaning that Tolkis is ignorant or is foolish or is, flatly stupid, right? I don't think that is why he is of no avail as a counselor, but rather he has little heed for either the past or the future. He is extremely present. And the thing about being extremely present is you're not going to be very good at giving advice, because you're not really thinking about what has been or what might come next. You're not really in a position to as Mandos would, right, to weigh and to judge and to deem the doom, right? You're not going to be able to give advice in that way, but he is a hardy friend. He is the guy that you want with you when you're in the moment too. Nessa here, very briefly described, Nessa literally translating as the young, right? And we get this note about how the beauty of youth is within her, much as the beauty of youth is within Vana too, who we'll get to in just a moment. And it's not, I think, that these are underdeveloped aspects of the pantheon. Well, Do I mean philosophically underdeveloped? I don't. I mean artistically underdeveloped. I mean that we need more stories of Nessa and of Vana in particular, but we'll talk about those as they come up. Tukas here in the Quenya, strong and steadfast, very straightforward. Astaldo, literally, as we get here, the valiant, right? We're getting the translation there for us too. We'll talk a little more about Tukas and Nessa as we move forward. Yes, as Elizabeth saying, himbo, lol. Yeah, Vincent says the jock of the Valar, a mix between the Flash and the Hulk. I mean, yeah, no, I mean more because Vinton, I know, comics are a language that we both speak together, but like kind of like the Marvel Hercules, right? Like kind of that energy. But I want to resist the urge, though it is constant, to read Tukas as being dumb, as being, all brawn, no brain. I think that it is much more about his presence in the moment, which is what functionally separates him and makes him such a skilled champion of the Valar. That is what separates him from so many of the others who are looking forward and back, who are connected with memory or with, growth as Yavanna is, or the making of things as Ali is, right? The making of something is always rooted in the future. You're moving forward into the creation of that thing. But Tukas is the one that is present right here, right now. And also we could maybe say the same is true of Nessa, right? If she is drawing her joy from dancing. Dancing is just a temporarily isolated act, right? It is a thing that exists in its specific moment. Even if it's replicated later, you're still kind of living in that space. Let's keep going. I cannot believe that I'm almost a full hour in and we haven't yet got to the diagram. We're going to get to the diagram, you guys. We've only got a couple more to go. Let's talk about Orome and Vana. Orome is a mighty lord. If he is less strong than Tukas, he is more dreadful in anger, whereas Tukas laughs ever in sport or in war, and even in the face of Melkor he laughed in battles before the elves were born. Orome loved the lands of Middle-earth, and he left them unwillingly and came last to Valinor. And often of old he passed back east over the mountains and returned with his host to the hills and the plains. He is a hunter of monsters and fell beasts, and he delights in horses and in hounds, and all trees he loves, for which reason he is called Alderon, and by the Sindar Tauron, the lord of forests. Nahar is the name of his horse, white in the sun and shining silver at night. The Valarama is the name of his great horn, the sound of which is like the upgoing of the sun in scarlet or the sheer lightning cleaving the clouds. Above all the horns of his host it was heard in the woods that Yavanna brought forth in Valinor. For there Orome would train his folk and his beasts in the pursuit of the evil creatures of Melkor. The spouse of Orome is Vana, the ever-young. She is the younger sister of Yavanna. All flowers spring as she passes, and open if she glances upon them, and all birds sing at her coming. It is difficult to escape the idea that maybe some of the Valier, the female Valar, are getting short shrift compared to the men, but here we are nonetheless. And I think that this opposition here, this contrast between Tukas and Orome is really interesting and developed, right? Tukas is this brawler, right? He laughs all the time. He laughs in sport and war. He laughs in the face of Melkor, for goodness sake. But Orome has no humor about him. He is more dreadful in anger. He is the hunter of monsters and fell beasts. And if Tukas is more like the Marvel Hercules, then maybe Orome is more like, Geralt of Rivia, right? He's more like the Witcher. There's a certain intensity to his process here. I love this line about the Valarama, the name of his great horn, the sound of which is like the upgoing of the sun in scarlet or the sheer lightning cleaving the clouds. The way that we pivot here, we have this synesthetic pivot away from the sound to the vision of it. Yeah, I absolutely love that. We're going to talk a lot about Orome. Orome is going to play key parts in the story of the Children of Iluvatar as it unfolds. And with that, we are done. We have made it, and these are the Valar. These are the names of the Valar and the Valier, and here is told in brief their likenesses such as the elder beheld them in Aman. But fair and noble as were the forms in which they were manifest to the Children of Iluvatar, they were but a veil upon their beauty and their power, and if little is said here of all that the Eldar once knew, that is as nothing compared with their true being, which goes back into regions and ages far beyond our thought. Among them 9 were of chief power and reverence, but 1 is removed from their number, and 8 remain. The Aratar, the High Ones of Arda, Manwe and Varda, Olmo, Yavanna and Aule, Mandos, Niena, and Orme. Though Manwe is their king and holds their allegiance under Eru, in majesty they are peers, surpassing beyond compare all others, whether of the Valar and the Maiar, or of any other order that Iluvatar has sent into Ea. I love how we conclude this with this again, an elevation of our rhetorical stance, right? We're leaning back into some of that more grandiose language because we've gone through and we've done the categorization, we've done the taxonomy. Here's your brief, monster manual description of each of the Valar. But before we're done, let's just remember that they are godlike, right? That to men, they are considered gods, that they are absolutely beyond our comprehension. As fair and noble as were the forms in which they were manifest to the children of Ilúvatar, they were but a veil upon their beauty and their power. As impressive as they seemed to the children of Ilúvatar, to elves and men alike, that's nothing compared to what they were really like. We are so limited in our apprehension that we cannot fully see the Valar. We cannot meet them where they are. And then, because Tolkien loves nothing so much as adding a further category that you have to remember and think about for the rest of your life, the Aratar, right? The 8 greatest of the 14 Valar now on Arda, the high ones of Arda: Manwe and Varda, Ulmo, Yavanna and Ale, Mandos, Nienna, and Orome. Let's take a look, and we will get to hopefully something approaching an understanding here as we go. These are the Valar, as you can see here. I've kind of glossed their domain, their function, right? I'm thinking now that I really wish I'd given Orome huntsman instead of forest, but I wanted to give like a sense of his domain more than just his job, right? I didn't want to say, that Mandos is like the doomsman of the Valar, but, doom is kind of his deal. So we have here all of them together: Ulmo, Manwe, Varda, Aule, Yavanna, Orome, Nienna, Námo, or Mandos, Vanna, Tucas, Nessa, Este, Irmo, or Lorien, and Vere. This is not the order in which they were given to us in the book, of course. This is not the order in which they are presented to us in that first accounting that we get at the beginning of the Valaquenta. But this is necessary because of the diagram that you're about to get, the diagram that I have so painstakingly prepared for you, which will hopefully illustrate a little bit about how they interact. First of all, we're going to split them by gender, just so that we can see how that plays out. So as you can see, 7 of the male Valar, 7 of the female Valier. We almost never use Valier or Valier. I've heard both pronunciations being held up as accurate. We almost never use it because when we refer to the Valar en masse, we default to the masculine name, right? They are en masse the Valar. The queens of the Valar are the Valier. This is basically then how this breaks down. Now, we'll also call out here the, if I can click through this here too. Yeah, we're also going to call out the Aratar, right? This is why they are arrayed like this. So we've got Ulmo and Manwe and Varda and Aule and Yavanna and Orome and Nienna and Mandos. They are the Aratar, and you can see the other 6 there too: Vanna, Tucas, Nessa, Este, Lorien, and Vere. Not the Aratar. Still great, still the Valar, right? But not as impressive as the Aratar, not as impressive as the high ones of Arda. So now we're going to get into the relationships between them, because I think that this is where we can really start to see what Professor Tolkien is doing, in terms of the schematic, and in terms of this diagrammatic approach. Because when you create a pantheon from scratch, more so than in any other way, I think, you are really getting to the heart of how you think the world operates and what you think is important. We talked last week about how aesthetics betray philosophy, and philosophy is turned in practice into politics. Well, we see it here, right? Water and air and stars and earth and life and forests and grief and doom and beauty and strength and speed and healing and dreams and memory. These are the qualities, right? Vanna, beauty there is the perfect beauty of youthfulness. So it's not youth necessarily that we are honoring. It is a youth that has been unmarred by experience, right? It is like the perfect potential of beauty unmarred. That's why I think we're leaning into her youth there. Okay, so let's take a look first of all by talking about the sibling pairs. Of course, we have a triplet here too, between the Valar. And of course, we will note here too, Manwe and Melkor, brothers in the mind of Ilúvatar, right? We'll kind of asterisk that because I'm not including Melkor on this sheet. But here we can see the relationships. Yavanna and Vanna are sisters. Oftentimes, again, people who want to criticize Tolkien. Well, I think that this is double-edged. People who want to criticize Tolkien say you shouldn't have a Yavanna and a Vanna. That's crazy. But as you can see here, the Vanna that is a part of the name of Yavanna and the Vanna that is Vanna's name are actually etymologically different, right? They do not come from the same root word. It's not the case that Vanna's name is simply a shortened form of Yavanna. So Yavanna and Vana are sisters. Orome and Nessa are siblings. That's the huntsman of the Valar and the dancer, right? Are youthful and exuberant. You remember in the slide that we just saw, right? Nessa loves deer and chases with them, but can outpace them. Well, we can see, I think, a compatibility there with Orome too, right? With the huntsman of the Valar. As we can see, a connection between Yavanna in her aspect of growth, right? It's not just that she loves trees and plants. It is that the growing of those things, that the restoration of those things, the constant and ongoing restoration and rediscovery of those things ties very neatly, I think, to Vana and her youthful beauty. And then we have Nienna and Mandos, both of whom are in the Aratar, and Lorien, who's not, which you've got to think is going to sting at Thanksgiving, right? Lorien just gets to sit at the kids' table every Thanksgiving in Valinor there. But we see how these three together are also kind of connected, right? Doom and dreams and grief, the idea of this stern and fixed judgment, right? The knowledge of what is, and then the speculation of what is not, and the way that these two things are unfolded into both grief and wisdom because we live in an imperfect world. All of which is to say that to me, the sibling relationships as they're presented to us are not casual, right? But they're also not causal. They are thematic. We are seeing a resonance between these sibling pairs and also this triadic cluster that we have here on the right of my diagram. In some cases, there are diagrams out there that will tell you that Tukas and Esti and Veri are also siblings, one to the others. That is not true. I don't know where that comes from. If you go to literally the Wikipedia page for the Valar, the diagram that is presented to you there, not as good as my diagram, obviously, will tell you that Tukas and Este and Veri are related, and they aren't. So I don't know where that came from. I don't know from what original source that was pulled, but I certainly can't find anything to validate that in my reading. So these are our sibling relationships. And obviously, right, sibling here is metaphorical. It is a notion of compatibility and resonance. We might think of it, if we're tempted to go back to the music of the Ainur, to think about particularly close harmonies, right? Which we can see here between Yavanna and Vana, between Orome and Nessa, between Nienna and Mandos and Lorien, right? I think that we can identify that they are close to each other and compatible with one another, consonant with one another in a really interesting way, thematically speaking. But then we have the spousal relationships. Manwe is married to Varda, Aule to Yavanna, Orome to Vana, Tukas to Nessa, Este to Lorien, and Mandos to Veri. We'll note here two stand apart. And in the descriptions that we just had in the Valaquenta, we note very specifically that both are alone. Ulmo does not marry. Nienna does not marry. They are isolated to some extent from the others. So Manwe and Varda, the air and the stars, we already talked a little about how upon the highest peak of Taniquetil, their powers are resonant with their powers. I really want to just excise that word from my vocabulary because I go to it as a crutch and it's not what I mean, right? Their abilities, their domains, their regions of authority and governance, perhaps, are compatible. We see how they fit together, right? Manwe is the air and Varda is the stars. There's a compatibility, the light by extension there too, right? But these are matters celestial. They are not bound to the surface of the earth. We can see a certain compatibility between them. Aule and Yavanna, I think, is the most interesting contrast that we get in this schematic approach because, of course, Aule is of the earth. He is the craftsman. He is very fixed. He is interested in the making of things, and Yavanna is the growing of things. So we can see not so much of a consonance there, not the consonance that we would see between Yavanna and Vana, but a kind of compatible opposition, right? A kind of schematic thoroughness. I'm just realizing that my camera has been over the little key here on my legend the whole time. This, I feel like, is a more ramshackle episode than I normally put out, and it is because we are forced into this position of aesthetic appreciation more so than close reading, which is, my usual métier, if not forte, for sure. We get Tukas here possessed of strength, and Nessa possessed of speed. We have Orome, right? As the huntsman, Orome, more than any other of the Valar, is occupied with, like, not death in its spiritual sense, but death in its physical sense, right? He will see the wounds and the bloodshed done to the monsters of Arda, right? The creatures of Melkor, and by extension to the children of Iluvatar when that happens too, right? He will see the hurt, the physicality of war and warfare on the face of Arda. So of course he is paired with Vana, this youthful, unmarred, timeless beauty. The purity of that stands in a kind of opposition, right? We're beginning to develop a schematic here that as Aule and Yavanna are kind of balanced between things that are made and things that grow, so Vana and Orome are kind of balanced between the injury of life on Arda and the purity of life on Arda, right? On the other hand, we've already talked about how Mandos and Veri are really quite compatible, right? The complete knowledge of history, no secret unknown to Mandos, and very faithfully just recording all of history as it unfolds. And similarly, Lorien and Este, right? Este could not presumably be as effective in her healing as she is in the Garden of Lorien because it is so beautiful, and beauty has its own power of restoration there. All of this is to say that I think we can glimpse here, albeit perhaps imperfectly and not really aided that much by this diagram. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, by the way, you can find the link to the slides in the show notes as always, and you'll be able to track down this diagram, for whatever good it will do you as we move through our discussion here. But I think that we can begin to see a kind of thorough and complete schematic of what Tolkien believes to be the movement of the world, the universe, right, of existence, of what is truly important and what is not. Here we see all of the major themes of the Lord of the Rings playing out, right? We have the natural world. We have specific through Aule, we have like good acts of creation as opposed to, Saruman, right? Saruman is a very functional, for those of you more familiar with the Lord of the Rings than with the Silmarillion, Saruman is a great counterpoint to Aule. That is what happens when that creative instinct is turned and perverted and twisted to darkness, right? I think we're getting a sense here of physicality and of the natural world and of being a part of that natural world, but also of looking celestially and having a sense of what lies beyond the scope of our personal experience, whether that is, Varda and the infinite stars of Ea arrayed above us every night, or it's Lorien and its dreams and visions and it's Mandos and its memory and its history as it unfolds. It's the knowledge of all things. I think you can see a lot here in terms of what Tolkien is doing and the ways that all of these things are instantiated as we move forward. I should call out to, I had a joke. Do you guys want a joke? Do you want a joke just to break the proceedings just a little bit? I had a joke here that I'm now not going to be able to segue to effortlessly. I rarely write jokes in my notes as I go, but I had this thought. One of the hardest things to do when I'm producing Stars and Swords, just to increase the degree to which the show is ramshackle, one of the hardest things to do is come up with a title for each episode, because I have to come up with the title before I've really finished my notes so that I can make the art, so that I can schedule the YouTube, so that I can put it all out. And, I need this stuff in advance. And I was really struggling today to come up with a title until I thought of Nienna and thought of Acquainted with Grief and how much time we're going to spend on that this evening. But I wish that I had spent a little more time thinking, because I would have had, this compatibility between our spousal pairs here, Aule and Yavanna saying to each other, I am of the earth and you are of the things that grow upon the earth. And in effect, you complete me. And then Yavanna can say back to Aule, you had me at Ea. Just a little Jerry Maguire joke for all of you at home. I do want to call out as we move forward here, because obviously let me come back in my full camera here. Because we're not going to spend an equal amount of time with each of the Valar, I wanted to call out exactly how significant each of them are going to be as we move through the reading of the Silmarillion, because these numbers are kind of wild. These numbers are taken from mentions of this specific Valar in the Silmarillion, excluding the appendices and the index of names that we get at the end of the book, right? So Manwë will appear 136 times in the Silmarillion. The name Manwë will appear 136 times. Ulmo, 87. Aule will appear 55. Orome will appear 50. Mandos will get 43, plus a bunch of references to the halls of Mandos. We get 2 specific references of Námo, but most of the time we're just going to talk about him as Mandos. Varda gets 29. Tukas gets 25. Nienna gets 10. Este gets 8. Lorien gets 5 mentions in the whole of the book. After the Valaquenta, Vana gets mentioned one more time. Nessa gets mentioned one more time. Veri does not get mentioned after the Valaquenta. So in a sense, though it's important, I think, to try to apprehend the full kind of clockwork mechanism of the schematic as it's presented to us, yeah, we probably don't have to remember that much about Veri. We probably don't have to remember that much about Vana or about Nessa as we move forward, sadly. Okay, gosh, I've been here for an hour and 15, and we still have to do the Maiar and the enemies. Let's get into it. So, as I say, we're looking at the Maiar as being of the same category of being prior to their emergence, or their descent is the phrase that Tolkien always uses, of course, their descent into Arda, right? Prior to the descent into Arda, they are Ainur, just like the Valar are. They are of less stature, they are less innately powerful, but they are the same type of being, and that is crucial as we understand, right? So this now, as we move into of the Maiar. With the Valar came other spirits, whose being also began before the world, of the same order as the Valar, but of less degree. These are the Maiar, the people of the Valar, and their servants and helpers. Their number is not known to the elves, and few have names in any of the tongues of the children of Iluvatar, for though it is otherwise in Aman, in Middle-earth the Maiar have seldom appeared in form visible to elves and men. We will, ultimately, I'm really counting now on my fingertips as I'm saying this out. Yeah, we're going to get more Maiar than we do Valar. We're going to get more named Maiar eventually than we get named Valar. We only get, though, 7 named Maiar in this part of the Valaquenta, and we will, yeah, as I say, get a few more later in this book, and then, in other works we'll get a few more. No, you know what? I don't think we do. I don't think we get more named Maiar than we do Valar, even though the Maiar outnumber the Valar considerably, although to an unknown degree, as we say. We don't really know how many Maiar there are in the world. But it is useful to think of exactly this phrase, right? Servants and helpers. Each of the Maiar is going to be aligned with one of the Valar, or more than one of the Valar. We'll move through the ones that we get sketched to us here in this part. Yeah, let's take a look at Osei and Unen. Chief among the Maiar of Valinor are names whose names are remembered in the histories of the elder days are Ilmari, the handmaid of Varda, and Eonwe, the banner-bearer and herald of Manwe, whose might in arms is surpassed by none in Arda. Okay, so let's just pause here to take these two out of the running here. Ilmari, the handmaid of Varda, and Eonwe, the banner-bearer and herald of Manwe, whose might in arms is surpassed by none in Arda. That is important. That is an important clarification here, right? For all that they are Maiar, Eonwe is, well, maybe not the best fighter taken out of everyone, but is possessed of the greatest might in arms, right? He might not be physically stronger. He might not be able to out-wrestle Tulkas, but you put a sword in his hand and he will be able to outfight Tulkas. You might not be able to outrace Orome, but again, give him weapons and he will be more skilled on the battlefield than Orome is. The distinction between the Maiar and the Valar is not one of category, but one of order. And even then, in specific ways, the Maiar can exceed even the Valar. They're just not either granted the same rulership and governorship over their aspects in Arda, or as generally powerful and proficient as the Valar are, right? So, to set aside Ilmari and Eonwe there, of all the Maiar, Osei and Inen are best known to the children of Iluvatar. Osei is a vassal of Ulmo, and he is master of the seas that wash the shores of Middle-earth. He does not go in the deeps, but loves the coasts and the isles, and rejoices in the winds of Manwe, for in storm he delights, and laughs amid the roaring of the waves. His spouse is Unen, the lady of the seas, whose hair lies spread throughout all waters under sky. All creatures she loves that live in the salt streams, and all weeds that grow there. To her mariners cry, for she can lay calm upon the waves, restraining the wildness of Osei. The Númenóreans lived long in her protection, and held her in reverence equal to the Valar. Melkor hated the sea, for he could not subdue it. It is said that in the making of Arda he endeavored to draw Osei to his allegiance, promising to him all the realm and power of Ulmo if he would serve him. So it was that long ago there arose great tumults in the sea that wrought ruin to the lands. But Uinen, at the prayer of Aule, restrained Osei, and brought him before Ulmo, and he was pardoned and returned to his allegiance, to which he has remained faithful, for the most part. For the delight in violence has never wholly departed from him, and at times he will rage in his willfulness without any command from Ulmo, his lord. Therefore those that dwell by the sea or go up in ships may love him, but they do not trust him. So we get this great mythological sense, right? That these lesser spirits are specific facets of the greater spirit. That is to say that the Maiar who serve a given Valar inhabit particular roles that are elements of that Valar's domain and dominion. Ulmo controls all waters, yes, but also controls like the seas that wash the shores of Middle, right? He is the coasts are really his domain. And Uinen, the lady of the seas, whose hair lies spread to all the waters under the sky, all creatures she loves that live in the salt streams and all weeds that grow there, right? And they are together because Ose is wild and unpredictable, and Uinen is able to calm him. And there, again, we see some of that like reciprocal connection between the two. Melkor hated the sea for he could not subdue it. We're really adding to the list of specific beefs that Melkor has here in the creation of Arda. He specifically hates Manwë, specifically hates Varda, and specifically... Oh, Aule, of course, yes. And now also specifically Ulmo, too. And Ose is persuaded by it, right? Ose is swayed by this argument in his rashness, in his boisterousness, in his exuberance, in his thoughtlessness. Ose is won over, but Aule, presumably because as Lord of the Land, he wants the sea to stop destroying things on the land, or destroying the land itself, even, and eating it away. I think that we see that contract there as he goes to Uinen and who is once again able to soothe Ose and bring him back before Ulmo, where he is pardoned, right? There's no malice here. This is complicated, and I almost want to set it aside because we're going to have better opportunities to talk about it. Yes, let's set this aside, and we'll look at it when we have more examples to draw from, because forgiveness is so important in the works of Tolkien, but also in its way underrepresented, right? We're going to talk about like the creatures of Melkor. We're going to talk about the fates that await some of those creatures as we move forward through the history of Arda. And I think, yeah, more perspective is only going to help as we try and figure all of that out. Most importantly here, though, reference to Numenor, to the Numenoreans. The Numenoreans lived long in her protection and held her in reverence equal to the Valar. Now, if you're reading the Silmarillion for the first time, the reference to Numenor is not going to mean anything to you. It's not illustrative, but to those of us who know, this is very clearly positioning this not as an early text in the ages of Arda, and not even as a first age text, right? But as a second age text, bare minimum second age text. If we take that past tense, the Numenoreans lived long in her protection, past tense. This could even be an early third age text that's being presented to us right now. This history of the Valar and the Maiar might be coming thousands of years into the documented history of Arda, even after the children awake. Let's move on here to two more of the Maiar who are being referenced here. Melian was the name of a Maia who served both Vana and Este. She dwelt long in Lorien, tending the trees that flower in the gardens of Irmo ere she came to Middle-earth. Nightingales sang about her wherever she went. Well, pause there, just a note. We're going to talk about Melian a lot. Melian is going to be very significant. Not next week's reading, but the following, chapter 4, yes. Not next week's reading, but the following week, we will get to talk about Melian, who is great. We're going to have a lot of interesting conversations about Melian's position in Middle-earth. And I shall say no more about it until we get there, because we have to talk about the last of the Maiar referenced here. Wisest of the Maiar was Olorin. He too dwelt in Lorien, but his ways took him often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. Of Melian much is told in the Quinta Silmarillion, but of Olorin that tale does not speak, for though he loved the elves, he walked among them unseen or in form as one of them, and they did not know whence came the fair visions or the promptings of wisdom that he put into their hearts. In later days he was a friend to all the children of Iluvatar, and took pity on their sorrows, and none who listened to him awoke from despair, and those who listened to him, awoke from despair and put away the imaginations of darkness. So, wisest of the Maiar, right? Unlike other examples, not the wisest of all the beings in Arda, but wisest of the Maiar was Olorin. He too dwelt in Lorien, right? Lorien, the gardens of Lorien, the place of healing and of restoration and of comfort to a certain degree, right? But he also goes often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. We don't talk about him in the Silmarillion. He's not going to appear again in the Silmarillion. In fact, for though he loved the elves, he walked among them unseen or in form as one of them, and they didn't know the influence that he had over them, right? The fair visions, the promptings of wisdom that he put into their hearts. In later days, he was a friend to all the children of Iluvatar and took pity on their sorrows, defined here by Nienna's great virtue, by pity here. Those who listened to him awoke from despair and put away the imaginations of darkness. And I almost don't want to spoil it if you don't know, but this is Gandalf. This is Gandalf that we're talking about. Gandalf will be of an order of beings called the Istari, right? Not a hierarchical taxonomic definition here, but just a group of Maiar who go into Middle-earth as wizards. 5 of them, right? Saruman, Radagast, Gandalf, and the 2 blue wizards. But here we can see already how Tolkien is layering in, how he is sowing the seed of the character that we will come to recognize in The Lord of the Rings, right? Because what do we associate with Gandalf? Well, we associate, magic powers and all of that, but the comfort of the garden, right? This is a Gandalf who has a pipe and who loves the hobbits and who visits Bag End, right? But also this enormous pity, the pity he has for the children of Iluvatar, the pity he has for those who are caught up in the strife of Arda marred, in the consequence of Melkor's great rebellion and betrayal and the fury and the malevolence thereafter, that he learns from Nienna, the comfort of Lorien and the pity of Nienna, turning that pain and that sorrow and that suffering into wisdom. That's our guy. That's our guy right there. And I love the restraint here of not qualifying it, of not calling it out, of not leaning on it even a little bit, just letting it be. And the reason that we don't, to be clear here, this isn't Tolkien, playing coy. This isn't an Easter egg in the modern sense, right? You won't believe the 5 secret Easter eggs hidden in the Silmarillion by Tolkien. This is him playing absolutely fair with this document. How do we know that at the latest this document comes from the early Third Age? Because the wizards have not yet gone to Middle-earth, right? He would be numbered here. If the author of this document knew what happened to Gandalf, it would have been included. It's not being artfully coy. It's just not there yet, right? It's not until like the 1000th year of the Third Age that the wizards go into Middle-earth. So he's going to be Olorin for a long time. Vincent says in the chat, I know him. Yes, exactly. Good. Yeah, I couldn't stop thinking of Gandalf saying pity. No, exactly, right? That is the quality. It's hard to get to necessarily when you're reading because, of course, we're in the midst of a plot and we're writing from this hobbity perspective and we're seeing Gandalf at a great distance and we don't always know the inner workings, right? We don't always know what it is that he's working for or working toward. But being able to layer in this great understanding of pity, right? I always think of the conversation with Frodo that he has at Bag End, right? Where Frodo's complaining that he wished that he wasn't living through these times, right? And Gandalf says, well, so do all who live to see such days, right? This is very much that pity put into practice. Not so much with a particular Took, who we'll talk about in days to come. So that is the Maiar. What do I have left? I've only got 2 slides left. Look at this, guys. We're going to be done absolutely on time. This is going to be perfect. Let's take a look at the enemies of the Valar. Last of all is set the name of Melkor, he who arises in might. But that name he has forfeited, and the Noldor who among the elves suffered most from his malice will not utter it, and they name him Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world. Great might was given to him by Iluvatar, he was coeval with Manwë. In the powers and knowledge of all the other Valar he had part, and he turned them to evil purposes, and squandered his strength in violence and tyranny, for he coveted Arda and all that was in it, desiring the kingship of Manwë and the dominion over the realms of his peers. From splendor he fell through arrogance to contempt for all things save himself, a spirit wasteful and pitiless. Understanding he turned to subtlety and perverting to his own will all that he could use, until he became a liar without shame. He began with the desire of light, but when he could not possess it for himself alone, he descended through fire and wrath into a great burning, down into darkness. And darkness he used most in his evil works upon Arda, and filled it with fear for all living things. Yet so great was the power of his uprising that in ages forgotten he contended with Manwë and all the Valar, and through long years in Arda held dominion over most of the lands of the earth. But he was not alone. For of the Maiar many were drawn to his splendor in the days of his greatness, and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness, and others he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous gifts. Dreadful among these spirits were called the Valarakor, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. So we get not just this diagram of the Valar and of goodness and virtue in all its various representations here in this schema of Arda, we also get this pretty useful roadmap to wickedness and villainy and darkness, right? From splendor, he fell through arrogance to contempt for all things save himself, a spirit wasteful and pitiless. He descended through fire and wrath into a great burning down into darkness. We've already learned, of course, that ultimately he will no longer be able to create. He will only be able to twist and pervert the creations of others, right? The worst and most poetic punishment or consequence of his rebellion, right? That Melkor will lose the thing that he valued the most, his ability to create. But in his splendor, in his glory, right, as a rebel voice, we saw this back in the Ainulindalë, of course, that when he starts singing discordantly, when he starts breaking the harmony of Ilúvatar, many voices around him fall silent, but some join in with him. Some see his glory and seek to ally themselves to it so that their voices rise with his. That continues as we move into Arda, right? He was not alone for the Maiar. Many were drawn to his splendor in the days of his greatness and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness. That even when he falls, they fall with him. Others he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous gifts. He is the deceiver, right? We're going to study exactly how this works as we move forward through the Quenta Silmarillion in the weeks to come. And then we get a real, it's funny for Tolkien being so reluctant to give us the word Gandalf. He'll give us the word Balrogs for sure, right? Dreadful among these spirits were the Valaquenta, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. And note what we're doing here, right? The Balrogs, also Maiar, also of the same order of being as Gandalf himself. And in fact, as we wrap up here, let's yes. Vinton is saying here in the chat, what is Coeval? Yeah, no, it is. It's a, look, do I have my note here? I don't, I think, even. I meant to pull it too, but it's a Quenya word, yes. If you could drop the definition of that into the chat, the strict definition, that would be awesome. In fact, if you have a moment to do that. We're going to move on and we're going to talk, the last slide of this evening, we're going to talk about Sauron, who is also, interestingly, a Maiar, right? Among those of his servants that have names, the greatest was the spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthaur the Cruel. In his beginning he was a Maiar of Aule, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In all the deeds of Melkor the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part. And he was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void. So, we see here this association, right? The Maiar still linked with their Valar. In the beginning, Sauron is, of course, a Maiar of Aule. Of course, he's going to be, apprenticed to the craftsman Valar, the craftsman of the Valar, I guess. He remains mighty in the lore of that people, right? He follows in the lore of Aule, and maybe someday he'll put that to use, wielding his mastery over the things, the fabric of Arda itself in order to create, I don't know, some kind of jewelry. In all the deeds of Melkor, the Morgoth upon Arda, I guess, hang on, we'll also pause here to observe Morgoth and Gorthaur, right? Names change when your position in society changes. We're going to talk about this endlessly as we get into particularly the kind of the Western diaspora of the elves as the children of Ilúvatar finally awake and are invited to Valinor. We are going to spend basically a whole session talking about the elves changing their names and changing each other's names and then changing their names again and splintering and each of those taking on a different name. We're going to do a lot of that. This is the linguistic basis of Tolkien's approach to mythopoeia, right? This is the kind of the kind of glossopoeia, I suppose, that we're doing here. He's finding in the names a deeper truth. So the elves do not refer to Melkor. Melkor is not a word that is spoken upon Arda anymore. Instead, they refer to Morgoth. Sauron, the Eldar called Sauron, or they called him Gorthaur the Cruel. In the beginning, he is this Maiar of Aule, is seduced by Melkor the Morgoth. In his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, right? So Sauron is with him basically from the jump all the way along. It is only less evil than his master, for long he served another and not himself, right? Which is an interesting inversion, because oftentimes now I think we tend to think of, I don't know, I'm struck by that video game argument, I suppose, which is also really many action movie arguments, where you will just like wade through henchmen and employees and minor opponents in the field of battle, and then you will hesitate when you are dealing with the big bad, because the big bad is possessed of a special agency, right? The big bad is possessed of a special potential for redemption in a really interesting way, and that's being inverted here by Tolkien. That Sauron is actually less evil than Morgoth because Morgoth is in charge and Sauron is following him, right? We would normally, or at least not normally, but we might at least feel an instinct to invert that. But no, not here. I find that absolutely fascinating. And then we get in after years, he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void. I'm sure we're not going to hear that much more about Sauron. I'm sure it's all going to be fine. That's going to do it, in fact, for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Next week, we get down to business in the Quenta Silmarillion. That is the story of the Silmarils with chapter 1 and 2. I can call up my schedule here. Yes, chapters 1 and 2 next week. That's the beginning of days, and then Aule and Yavanna, a really, really great chapter that's going to give us a lot to talk about, and a really functional example of what marriage, what the spousal relationship looks like for the Valar. I think that it's such a great story. I can't wait to get to that. And then the following week, yes, Melkor and Melian we'll get to talk about in that reading. But that's not all. That's not all that you can expect from Stars and Swords, even over the next couple of days, because I have a whole other, attendant podcast, like a supplemental podcast that's going to come out in the next couple of days. I've written a pop quiz, you guys, and I'm going to release it as a podcast, and I'm going to release it as a video over on the YouTube page. If you want to test your knowledge of the Valar and a few other things besides, then you can just keep an eye on your podcast app, or head on over to the YouTube page and subscribe there. The link to that will be in the show notes. Probably Saturday, I'm thinking I'm going to drop it. We'll just have a little cozy Saturday weekend. I don't know if it's as cold where you are as it's going to be here, but maybe we'll just have a cozy Saturday morning, and we can move through a little trivia game together. I'm not promising to do that every week, but as I say, this thing is already growing. The tale is growing in the telling, and I think that between a few pop quizzes as we move through the rest of the Silmarillion and some Q&A episodes, I'll probably keep your podcast feeds pretty full. And if that's not enough, I should also warn you of an incoming bonus episode. It is going to slip to the beginning of February, but that's only appropriate because we are going to be looking at category romance sometime around Valentine's Day. We're talking specifically about Harlequin romance. It took a long, long time to find the perfect book, right? That is a completely mainstream Harlequin romance that is an interesting example of many of the generic impulses of the Harlequin line, taken as broadly as possible. Harlequin uses so many different imprints, each of which has a very specific purpose. But we spent some time looking, and I finally found Beauty and the Playboy Prince by Justine Lewis, released in January of 2024. You're going to be able to go and find the link to that in the show notes too. By all means, read it. I'm going to read it. I'm going to talk a little about it. But really, we're using it as a codex. We're using it as a Rosetta Stone to understand what category romance is doing in 2024, how romance as a genre operates, how romance as an industry operates. We're going to look at the conventions, and we're going to look at the expectations. We're going to look, I promise, at the way these books are marketed, which is absolutely fascinating and completely distinct from every other genre form out there, except one. And I'm not even going to spoil what that conclusion is. There's one other genre, speaking very hesitantly, that is marketed the way that these romance novels are marketed. We're going to talk about how story works at a very basic level and how it's being instantiated in the broad and sprawling and really quite overwhelming Harlequin line. It's going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation, whether you think you care about category romance or not. I encourage you to go and read Beauty and the Playboy Prince. I myself haven't read it yet, so I can't really testify to the quality of the work, but it is, I'm assured, a decent exemplar of the line as a whole. That's going to be an absolute blast. That's going to do it for this week. A bare hour and 40 minutes less. It's easy. Should we go back to the diagram? We can talk a little more about the diagram if it would help you guys. All the links to everything are in the show notes. Thank you so much for supporting me here. If you would like to help me make more things, if you would like me to, I don't know, increase this to 3 podcasts a week while we're going through the Silmarillion, then by all means, head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword, where you can subscribe for free. You can just follow that page for free in order to get the links to the live YouTube sessions every Thursday night, or you can pledge a few bucks a month to help me upgrade all of the equipment that has been breaking over the course of the last few weeks here in the studio, and hopefully manage to avoid any terrible audio calamities like last week and the loss of that entire show, which had to be re-recorded. It would have been great if I had been able to put out something extra last week instead of re-recording that show, but hey, here we are. And if you would just like more, if you want me to talk about The Witcher, if you want me to talk about, I don't know, Marvel Comics starring Hercules and other Greek mythical figures, if you want me to run some kind of Dungeons & Dragons campaign, some actual play podcast shenanigans, then I'll probably wind up doing that too. That's patreon.com/nextword. And that's the end of this week's show. Thank you all so much for listening. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, let us all live like Nienna. Let us exhibit pity and mercy, and thus turn sorrow to wisdom.